In 1944, the most dangerous pilots in the American military weren't flying over Berlin or Tokyo. They were flying alone, at night, 600 feet off the ground, over Nazi-occupied France. Their mission was to drop weapons to the French resistance and push Allied spies out of aircraft into total darkness. When they came home after the war, they weren't allowed to tell anyone what they'd done. The Central Intelligence Agency kept their missions classified for 50 years. Their service records were locked away or destroyed. Some veterans couldn't even prove they'd served in combat at all. They were called the Carpetbaggers. And this is the story of how America erased its bravest pilots from history. 20 miles west of London, hidden in the English countryside, there was an airfield that didn't officially exist. Royal Air Force Harrington had no signs, no public records, just rows of B-24 Liberator bombers painted completely black, sitting on a runway that locals were told to ignore. This was the home of Operation Carpetbagger, a joint mission between the United States Army Air Forces and the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime predecessor to the CIA. The operation ran from January 1944 until April 1945, and everything about it was classified from the start. The Office of Strategic Services needed pilots, not ordinary pilots. They needed men willing to fly missions so dangerous that military brass could not order anyone to do them. So they went looking in an unusual place, deactivated anti-submarine squadrons. These were pilots who had spent months flying alone over the Atlantic Ocean, hunting German U-boats. No formation flying, no fighter escort, just a man, his crew, and thousands of miles of empty ocean. The Office of Strategic Services gathered them at Harrington, briefed them on what they would be asked to do, and gave them a choice. Fly alone across the English Channel at night, descend to 600 feet over enemy territory, slow down to 110 miles per hour, barely above stall speed, find a drop zone lit only by flashlights held by French resistance fighters, and drop your cargo without getting shot down by German night fighters or anti-aircraft guns. Every single pilot who was briefed volunteered. Author Bruce Henderson spent years tracking down the survivors and their families for his book, Midnight Flyboys. As he explained in an interview, the B-24 was designed to fly at high altitude in formation. Instead, these crews were asked to fly solo at night to find a dark field in France. If they were at 1,500 feet, they could recover from a mistake. But at 600 feet, they would crash. If you are learning something new right now, take a second and hit subscribe. I cover forgotten military history like this every week, stories about heroes who were erased, classified, or simply forgotten. The algorithm will not show you this channel unless you subscribe, so hit the button and I will see you in every video. Now let me tell you what these pilots actually had to do when they reached their targets. The standard B-24 Liberator was a high-altitude heavy bomber. It had 4 engines and 10 crew members. It was designed to fly at 25,000 feet, in tight formation with dozens of other aircraft, providing mutual protection. The Carpetbaggers stripped theirs down and modified them for a completely different purpose. They removed the ball turret, the gun position that hung from the belly of the aircraft, and replaced it with something called a Joe hole. The Joe hole was a cargo hatch built into the floor of the bomber. Through it, crews pushed steel containers filled with rifles, hand grenades, plastic explosives, radio equipment, medicine, and even bicycle tires for the French resistance fighters below. Over the course of the operation, Carpetbagger crews dropped 4,522 tons of supplies to resistance movements across occupied Europe. Supplies were lifelines. But supplies weren't the only cargo. On other nights, they pushed people through that Joe hole. Allied secret agents climbed aboard at Harrington and parachuted into Nazi-occupied territory to coordinate with resistance movements, sabotage German operations, and send intelligence back to London. The Carpetbagger crews only knew these agents as Joe or Josephine. No real names, no personal details. Just a person who climbed into the aircraft in England and jumped into the void somewhere over France, Belgium, or Norway. 556 agents were delivered behind enemy lines this way. The flights themselves pushed the limits of what was physically possible. Henderson documented the impossible physics in his research. At 600 to 800 feet altitude, there was no margin for error. A single mistake, a moment of distraction, a gust of wind pushing the aircraft toward a hillside, and you were dead before you knew what happened. No margin. The success rate reflected the danger. Only 60 to 70% of missions succeeded. The rest were aborted due to weather, enemy activity, or the inability to locate tiny drop zones in total darkness. But the carpetbaggers kept flying, night after night, for 16 months. When it was over, they had completed 1,860 sorties and dropped over 20,000 supply containers across occupied Europe. Their presidential unit citation declared that no group of this size has made a greater contribution to the war effort. Citation and recognition were official, but incomplete. But that contribution came at a price that wouldn't be known for decades. 230 Carpetbagger airmen were killed in action during the 16 months of Operation Carpetbagger. Approximately 33 aircraft never came back to Harrington. That's roughly one plane lost for every 56 missions flown. For context, the overall loss rate for the 8th Air Force during daylight bombing raids over Germany in 1944 was around 1 aircraft per 50 missions. The Carpetbaggers, flying alone at night without escort, faced worse odds than the crews bombing Berlin in broad daylight. The men who survived often became legends in their own right, though no one would know their stories for half a century. First Lieutenant Johnny Meade was a carpetbagger bombardier whose B-24 was hit by anti-aircraft fire over France. He parachuted out of his burning aircraft and landed in occupied territory. Most downed American airmen tried to escape back to Allied lines through underground networks. Meade did the opposite. He joined the French resistance. He didn't just assist them as an extra fighter. He became the commander of the Maquis de Fragny, growing the guerrilla unit from 12 fighters to over 60. When the Germans discovered his camp and sent 200 troops along with 30 members of the collaborationist milice to destroy it, they failed. An American bombardier, stranded in occupied France, had become a guerrilla leader. Then there was Nancy Wake, known to the Gestapo as the White Mouse, because she kept escaping their traps. Wake was a British Special Operations executive agent dropped into France by a carpetbagger aircraft. She was terrified of heights. A crewman literally had to push her out of the plane and into the darkness over occupied territory. Once she was on the ground, she became one of the most effective operatives in the European theater. At one point, she made a 400-mile bicycle ride in 72 hours to deliver an urgent message to London. When she arrived, she couldn't walk for a week from the physical strain. Henri Tardivat, a French resistance leader who worked alongside her, later said that she was the most feminine woman he knew until the fighting started. Then, she was like 5 men. These were the people the carpetbaggers delivered into the darkness of Nazi-occupied Europe. And when the war ended, all of them, the pilots, the agents, the ground crews, were told the same thing. Don't talk about it. To anyone. Ever. On September 20th, 1945, just weeks after the Japanese surrender, President Harry Truman signed an executive order terminating the Office of Strategic Services. The Office of Strategic Services was gone, but its secrets were not. All operational records, including everything about Operation Carpetbagger, transferred to the newly formed CIA. The CIA had no intention of letting anyone know what had happened during the war. The logic made sense at the time from an intelligence perspective. The techniques the carpetbaggers had used, the covert supply drops, the agent insertions, the coordination with resistance movements, Those same techniques were being deployed in the early Cold War, in Eastern Europe, in China, and in Korea. Revealing World War II tradecraft could compromise active CYA operations using identical methods. So the carpetbaggers were told to stay silent, and they did, for 50 years. Historian Tara Ross documented the consequences in her research on the operation. The air crews came home after the war, unable to tell friends and family what they had done. The missions were still a secret, and stayed that way for decades. Some carpetbagger veterans could not even join the veterans of foreign wars. To join the VFW, you needed to prove you had served in combat overseas, but their records were classified. Their missions officially did not exist. How do you prove something that, according to the government, never happened? Veteran Robert Holmstrom, interviewed for the PBS documentary Night Wings, explained the impossible situation. "So many people do not know what we did," he said, "because nothing was ever written down." He added the timeline that defined their silence. He said the material would remain classified into the next century. So for 60 years, into the 21st century, all of it remained classified. But classification was not the only enemy erasing these men from history. On July 12, 1973, a fire broke out at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri. The blaze burned for 4 days before firefighters could extinguish it. When the smoke cleared, 80% of Army personnel records from 1912 to 1960 had been destroyed, gone forever. This included Army Air Force personnel files for millions of World War II veterans. The fire did not target the carpetbaggers specifically. It was an accident caused by unknown ignition in a storage area with no sprinkler system. It completed what classification had started. Even if the CIA eventually released the operational records, many individual service records no longer existed to corroborate them. A family member of a carpetbagger veteran posted on the military genealogy website Fold 3 about trying to find her relative's records. She wrote that there was a fire in St. Louis which destroyed his records, and contacting the government has not been productive. When Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur tried to obtain records about her uncle's OSS service, the National Defense Personnel Center responded with a single devastating sentence. Records of her uncle are not in the center's files. He had served. He had risked his life flying into Nazi-occupied Europe, and officially, there was no proof he had ever existed. The carpetbaggers weren't the only forgotten pilots of World War II. Half the story played out on the other side of the globe. Halfway around the world, in the Pacific Theater, another group of aviators was flying missions just as dangerous and facing the same historical erasure. They were called the Black Cats, and they flew the PBY Catalina, one of the strangest aircraft of the war. The Catalina was a flying boat with a 104-foot wingspan and a maximum speed of only 196 miles per hour. It was originally designed for reconnaissance patrols and anti-submarine warfare, missions where speed did not matter as much as range and endurance. In daylight, against Japanese Zero fighters, the PBY was a death trap. Patrol Wing 10 in the Philippines started the war with approximately 43 Catalinas. Within 3 days of the Japanese attack on December 8, 1941, enemy fighters had reduced them to 11. So the Navy did something radical. They painted the surviving Catalinas matte black, using an improvised mixture of lamp soot and soap. They equipped them with early radar sets, and they sent them hunting at night when Japanese fighters could not find them. The Black Cat tactic was simple and absolutely terrifying. Locate a Japanese ship using radar. Descend to mast height between 50 and 150 feet above the water. Release 4 500-pound bombs with 5-second delay fuses so the explosion would not destroy your own aircraft. Open fire with every gun on the plane. Drop illuminating flares to blind the enemy gunners. And run. These were 63-foot-long flying boats cruising at 125 miles per hour through total darkness, 50 feet above enemy warships bristling with anti-aircraft guns. The margin for error was measured in seconds. By war's end, Black Cat squadrons had sunk or damaged an estimated 2.8 million tons of Japanese naval and merchant shipping. 14 squadrons rotated through Black Cat operations in the Pacific, and their cumulative impact on Japanese logistics was devastating. The program also produced the only Medal of Honor ever awarded to a PBY Catalina pilot. Lieutenant Nathan Green Gordon of Patrol Squadron 34 was flying his Catalina named Arkansas Traveler on February 15, 1944. His mission was to support a 5th Air Force attack on Kavieng Harbor in the Pacific. American B-25 bombers had been shot down during the attack. Their crews were in the water, surrounded by Japanese-held territory. Shore batteries were still firing. Gordon made 3 separate water landings under enemy fire to rescue the downed airmen. One landing was only 600 yards from Japanese gun positions, close enough that enemy soldiers could have hit him with rifle fire. He pulled 15 men out of the water while under constant attack. His final takeoff was nearly impossible. He had 24 men crammed aboard a dangerously overloaded aircraft. The swells were heavy. There was almost no wind to assist liftoff. A lesser pilot would have crashed. Gordon got airborne and brought everyone home. All 8 members of his crew received Silver Stars for the mission. Gordon later served 10 consecutive terms as Lieutenant Governor of Arkansas, though few voters knew about his Medal of Honor. But like the carpetbaggers in Europe, the Black Cats were forgotten by official history. A National Archives archivist later admitted the institutional logic behind the erasure. Since the PBY Catalina was known to be obsolete before the war even started, there was really no need to show how flying the PBY was lethal in contested airspace. So the casualty statistics for Black Cat operations were never even compiled. The carpetbaggers were erased by classification. The Black Cats were erased by indifference. Different mechanisms, same result. Extraordinary courage rendered invisible. It took 73 years. On March 21, 2018, the surviving members of the Office of Strategic Services, including the Carpetbagger air crews, received the Congressional Gold Medal in a ceremony at the United States Capitol. The medal's design tells its own story about erasure. It features 3 silhouette figures with no facial features, representing the anonymity that had defined and imprisoned these veterans for decades. They served in the shadows. They were honored in silhouette. Only 16 OSS veterans were healthy enough to attend the ceremony in person. At the time, roughly 100 former OSS members were believed to still be alive. Most had already died, their extraordinary service unknown even to their own children and grandchildren. The Smithsonian Institution collected one of the Congressional Gold Medals for permanent display. In their 2023 report on the collection, curators noted that of the approximately 13,000 men and women who served in the OSS during World War II, fewer than 100 are believed to still be alive today. The Black Cat veterans fared no better in the race against time. Cash Barber of Patrol Squadron 11 was still volunteering weekly at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola in 2024 at the age of 100. He represents one of the last living connections to that chapter of Pacific War history. When asked about the PBY Catalina, Barber was characteristically understated. He said it was slow and noisy and looked like a whale, but it was very reliable. He still remembers carrying a cigar box filled with wooden plugs on every mission. Standard equipment for Black Cat crews. A rough water landing could pop rivets out of the hull, and you needed to pound wooden plugs into the holes before your aircraft sank beneath you. Bruce Henderson has spent his career as an author finding these stories before they disappear completely. Midnight Flyboys, published in November 2025, represents his attempt to give the carpetbaggers the recognition they were denied for half a century. Henderson was drawn to the story when a pilot's granddaughter approached him, searching for information about what her grandfather had done during the war. He also had personal motivation. His own uncle, First Lieutenant Robert Silva, was lost over the North Sea during World War II. For Henderson, recovering these lost stories is not just historical research, it's personal. In 1944, these men climbed into black-painted bombers on an airfield that didn't exist and flew into the darkness over Nazi-occupied Europe. They dropped weapons to resistance fighters who were risking their lives to free their countries. They pushed Allied spies into the void, knowing those agents might never be seen again. They flew at 600 feet through anti-aircraft fire, came home before dawn, and did it again the next night. When the war ended, they were told to stay silent. For 50 years, they kept that promise. Many died without ever telling their children what they had done. The carpetbaggers, the black cats, the agents they delivered behind enemy lines. They didn't fight for recognition. They didn't demand parades or monuments. They fought because the mission mattered, and then they came home and said nothing about it for the rest of their lives. That's what duty looked like for that generation. But their silence shouldn't mean our forgetting. If we don't tell their stories, if we don't say their names, if we don't make sure the next generation knows what ordinary people are capable of when everything is on the line, then the erasure becomes permanent, and they deserve better than that. If this story moved you, if you think these men and women deserve to be remembered, then do one thing. Subscribe to this channel, not for the algorithm, not for me, for them. Also, comment below if someone in your family or among your friends served in the military. Tell us their stories.